but it was my first time to eat it, actually. But it was good, though, I thought. Yeah, I think somewhat inconsistent with School of Public Health, maybe, but not. Yeah. So great fun, yeah. So anyway, I hope you're ready for 76 years, because that's going to take a long time. So I thought I'd just start at the beginning. I thought I'd go just through sequentially what I've been up to for 76 years. So I was born in Grand Valley, Ontario, which is on the Grand River, but a different Grand River than the one in Michigan. This one empties into Lake Erie and runs through southern Ontario. Small town, actually, not even a town, a hamlet, I guess, of about 400 at the time. My father and mother were both teachers. My father was a math teacher, actually, and very committed to mathematics and wanted to make sure that we liked mathematics and in any way he could. My mother was actually a supply teacher until the kids left home, or until the kids got into school, and then took up full-time teaching. I had 3 siblings. I have an older brother, Jim, and on the left here is my mother with Jim and me some time ago, looking out over the Grand River, I think. And then I had a sister that came a couple of years later, Carol, shown in the center picture with my father. And then on the right's a few years later, so Jim, myself, Carol, and a younger brother, Peter, who came 8 years after me. He was something of an afterthought, or perhaps not a thought at all. But at any rate, my older brother, I'll say a bit more about him later, about Jim. My sister actually finished her career as an executive at Sun Life in Canada. My younger brother became a corporate lawyer in Vancouver, BC, and he was the wealthy one of the 4 of us, and now retired and living there. Living there half the time and half the time in Florida. So I moved 3 times when I was in my childhood years. Actually, when I was 3, moved to Orangeville, though I don't remember that. That was about 14 miles down the road from Grand Valley, somewhat larger town. Then in 59, moved back to Grand Valley and then to Goderich finally. So I went to 3 different high schools. First 2 years in Orangeville, 2 years in Goderich, and then the final year 2 years in Grand Valley, and then the final year in Goderich. So at that time, Ontario had a 13-year system, so that I had 5 years in high school. It wasn't that I failed one of them. Just want you to make that clear. So anyway, my father actually also taught me, and it was the one constancy through high school, that my father taught me mathematics in Orangeville, Grand Valley, and Goderich. There was lots of mathematics at home. For example, very early on, we used to have dinner time quizzes. This would allow you to leave the table if you could get the right answer. So he would rhyme off these. This is a very short one. Sometimes they went on for a couple of minutes. But this one, if you've ever, very confusing later on, of course, because you actually think that the answer of that is going to be minus 15. But the answer to that is in fact not minus 15, but rather 16. That's because we're computing it from left to right, right? So you don't, there's no priority of operations in that. So. We lived in a brick house, an old brick house built in the 19th century, late 1890s, in Orangeville. And actually this picture is relatively early on. You can see down in the lower left corner there our Model A Ford. That shows you how old I am. That Model A Ford, that was one of the older cars in the neighborhood, actually, at the time. But I remember taking trips in the Model A Ford where we would warm up the bricks in the oven before you left so that you put them on the floor. There was no heater in the car. And if you were taking a winter trip, it was quite an undertaking. And I also, you can see from very early on, I was mechanically inclined, that here I am fixing my bicycle with a hammer. And seemingly quite pleased about it. So I finished high school, actually went on to undergraduate studies at U of W. This is something that's used by the undergraduate mathematicians, mathematics students at university to distinguish it from the University of Washington and the University of Wisconsin, so it's U of W with a functional notation. And so I was there from 62 to 66. I actually had two possibilities. I was thinking about the University of Toronto, which is, as they will tell you for sure then and even now, that they are the preeminent university in Canada, where I could have gone and had an offer there, and decided instead to go to Waterloo, which one thing was it gave me a bigger scholarship, but there were other things about it too. It was a fledgling school. I only had 3 buildings when I arrived there and tons of mud. School had just begun in 1957, so it was 5 years later, 5 years in the going. They were still building things, but only 3 buildings. It had, however, quite a decent mathematics department headed by Ralph Stanton, who's pictured here. So he was the head of the math and also a really good recruiter of people from high schools. He was actually a pretty good mathematician too, but he would go visit high schools and had others in the university that went and visited high schools, and they built up this scholarship program as well. And so there was a very strong outreach, and people knew about it, and they gathered top mathematics students from all over the country, especially from all over Ontario and some outside of the province. So in particular, actually, when I was in my last year of high school, I visited Waterloo and let them know I was coming, and Ralph Stanton met me, Professor Stanton met me, and spent some time with me and walked me up to the ceiling up to the roof of the physics building to overlook the campus, what there was of it, just 2 buildings and mud, but pointed out where the mathematics building was going to be built, as in fact it was 4 years later. So, but anyway, that kind of attention, I think that was part of it, and it was also the excitement, I think, of something that was starting up, that it actually seemed I had a feeling at the time that it was a place with a lot of potential, even though there wasn't all that much there at the time. So anyway, that's what I decided to do, go to the University of Waterloo, and it worked out pretty well. I started in chemistry, physics, and math. I thought I had interest in both chemistry and physics, but it turned out in the first year I got tired of chemistry and then physics. Third and fourth year I got pretty tired of mathematics too, actually, with measure theory and topology and other things that we took then. And so finally I decided on statistics, or majored in statistics. I think that was a path taken by quite a few people. I never actually, I never thought about doing computing, and I often have wondered why I never thought about doing computer science, because it was really in its infancy now, and it was something that was growing, and a lot of my classmates thought it was a very exciting area. I thought it was rather painful, actually, with punch cards and waiting to get your program back and all of that sort of thing. But I think I didn't have the vision as to what computing would or could become at the time. Anyway, statistics turned out pretty well. It's not that it's not that it's something I really feel I lost out on. So undergraduate days, actually, as I said, recruiting from all across the country, so that I had a class. The first freshman class was actually about 60 students in mathematics, but there was a stream section. I was in the better section, I guess, the scholarship section. Had about 30 students, and more than half of those went on to get university appointments, faculty appointments at various universities in Canada, the US, and the UK. Also, several went into computing, and a number of them set up their own companies and that sort of thing and became very rich. A number of them didn't become rich, too. In my class, actually, was Jerry Lawless and Ross Prentice, be known to a number of you, I think, as two quite well-known statisticians. At this point, I've worked with both Jerry and Ross over the years. Jerry I first met in a chemistry lab in 1962, my first day at University of Waterloo, and I've known him now for 57 years and worked with him in many situations. You probably heard this stuff about computing evolution. It just was quite amazing what happened in those 4 years, and of course amazing what's happened since. when I arrived at the university, we did calculation on Monroe calculators. Most days you actually did your sums by, but with an electronic calculator. It was electronic, at least you didn't have to do this. And then to a system that involved cards and giving them to the computer and getting cards back and giving them to a printer, and then finally learning out that you made a mistake in the first line and have to start over again. And then to something which was more efficient in terms of getting your feedback, but still with cards. My final year, actually, we got these APL terminals, which were IBM Selectric typewriters that had APL balls in them so that you could actually type the APL characters. APL stands for a programming language, and actually it's like a precursor of S, S+, and R. And actually that, so we used that actually a lot, and it was actually, gave you immediate feedback. You could submit programs and run them sort of in batch as well with it, but it was actually quite flexible and an amazing advance. I did things in the drama club, the Gilbert and Sullivan Society when I was in university, and played way too much bridge. I was in residence, often played bridge until 3 in the morning and that sort of thing. So these are the calculators. This actually is an older version than we had. This one had a handle you had to turn. Ours you plugged in at least, and if you divided by 9 for however many digits there were, it gave some really nice rhythms that you sounded like a marching band sometimes. So, and APL, actually just a curiosity given what my father taught me. APL, you actually compute things right to left. So if you look at this same expression, again, it's still not minus 15, but it turns out you go 2 times 5 is 10, take that away from 8, and so forth. So you get minus 2, and then take minus 2 away from 3, that gives you 5, etc. And the result then is now minus 1. So, okay. But there was actually some convenience in that you could avoid a lot of bracketing by that convention. So summer jobs at the time, I worked at Easter SEAL camps actually in Ontario every summer, so I left all university stuff alone until after my 4th year. And they were, actually they were called crippled children's camps in those days. That what's politically correct changes over time, but so they were crippled children's camps in Ontario. There were a number of them, and I worked at 2 different ones. Started as a kitchen boy and worked up eventually to program director. For my last couple of years, met my wife Sharon there. Sometimes call her my first wife, but she doesn't really like that. But, in June 1963, and we graduated, and I graduated in 1966 and got married that year. You can see this is the wedding picture. I was about 15, as you can see, and my brother Jim, I think, was 17. There, my sister and my younger sister and brother as well. So graduate work, actually, in the 4th year, I took a number of courses from David Sprott, who's on the bottom left there. And we had actually begun working on a paper that was to be published in the Journal of the American Statistical Association. And it was eventually published in the Journal of the American Statistical Association, although I think it's been reviewed so many times everybody had read it before it was published. But at any rate, I had started working on that with him, and so it seemed natural actually to continue into the master's program at Waterloo and eventually then into the PhD. At that point, things had grown a lot, so my feeling about Waterloo was right. The mathematics faculty had become a faculty on its own, a school on the same footing with arts and science, a big advantage for the mathematical sciences to have that. David Sprott was my supervisor then for the PhD. Other mentors were my brother, who had come to Waterloo at that point, VP Gadambi, who was a survey sampler and actually a very deep thinker, I think VP Gadambi is, or was. And George Barnard, who is actually from University of Essex in England, who visited the department a number of times and was an external examiner for me. Gadambi in the middle, behind him is written, "Out of confusion, clarity." And I don't know whether that's original with him. It seems to be But anyway, I think it's a great term, and it worked particularly well with Gadambi and his courses, I think. But he quite deep, you never could quite figure out what it was he was doing until much later, but out of confusion, clarity. So my brother, just to say a little bit about him, actually, because he was actually very significant in my life in many, many ways, much more, I think, than many brothers would be. We had very similar careers in some ways and different in others. He was 3 years older. He was a very good mathematician, studied maths at the University of Toronto, and did his PhD in combinatorial mathematics at Waterloo. He'd come to Waterloo when I was in second year. He actually had a strong interest in statistics, and he worked in statistics, wrote a number of papers in that area, and also wrote 2 books in probability and statistics, and they're really good books. And it's really nice because people think I wrote them. But at any rate, he eventually, actually, he became chair quite early, and then dean also fairly early, and became very interested in university administration, and eventually went into becoming an associate provost and a provost, finished his career as provost at the University of Waterloo. And he had a real skill, I think, at basically organizing things, figuring out figuring out systems, basically, how to make systems work. And I think he had a real skill that fit very well with the administrative role, the central administrative role at the university. So we had somewhat similar paths for a while, and then somewhat different paths toward the end. So life as a grad student, because there are a lot of grad students here, and I can tell you a little bit. First of all, coursework was pretty good. There were no exams and very few assignments, and at the end of a term you'd have to write a project on the course somehow and give a talk usually in the course. But so if you were interested, you were expected that you'd spend some time working on it, but otherwise you just had to get up to a certain level. You didn't really have to learn everything in every course, which was really nice. But, I had a National Research Council scholarship, which was quite generous, actually pretty good, although not as generous as in the second year of my graduate studies, when the faculty was really short on teachers, and so they stepped down into the undergraduate or into the graduate students to see if they could get people to teach some of the sections. So I taught a first-year mathematics course and a third-year statistics course. Others taught other things, but basically taught those courses in the graduate year, which actually was, although it took a lot of time out of what things that I should have been doing, I found it really, really very useful and very, very helpful, actually, to have that experience in teaching at that level. As I said, David Sprott was my supervisor. I think he only supervised 3 students. I think most students found him a little bit frightening, maybe. But I actually very much enjoyed Dave and thought he was a really interesting person. He had a very strong view of Fisherian methods in statistics. Ronald Fisher's sort of pictured down here on the right, but I think in Dave's view, Ronald Fisher was perhaps the greatest man that ever lived. And he was pretty great, but I'm not sure about that. So anyway, we worked a lot on inferential things that had to do with mostly with what was called Fisherian statistics at that time, and still, I guess, but things based on likelihood, based on fiducial probability in particular at that time. At that point, fiducial probability was really something that you weren't supposed to work in. It was an absolute no-no. It had been clearly dismissed earlier. I didn't realize that, but my first paper actually was on likelihood and fiducial probability in the title. But it's now made a resurgence, a comeback. I guess there are now conferences every year on fiducial probability, so I guess maybe I should pull some of those old things out. My first conference is actually in Madison, Wisconsin. It was a conference actually on the future of statistics, sort of Wither statistics, I think it was called, with an H, I think. And then Chapel Hill, there was a conference on the foundations of survey sampling, and I gave my first paper actually at that, paper on likelihood and fiducial probability in survey sampling based on a superpopulation model of survey sampling. I still think it's kind of a neat work. It was actually about the same time that Erickson was doing things from the Bayesian perspective, and a very close similarity between the two, except Erickson couldn't work in randomization and we did. Thesis defended in 1969. I defended my thesis then. George Barnard was my external examiner. George Barnard was an extremely interesting individual, and a pleasure to know. I intersected with him a fair bit, and he actually became on faculty later on at Waterloo when I was on faculty there. I remember actually asking him advice. I had the chance to go to Bell Labs in New Jersey, or to Buffalo, or to take a scholarship to the National Research Council would let me go anywhere and spend a postdoctoral year. And I remember asking George what he thought I should do, and he didn't waste a second to say, if you've got a scholarship that'll take you anywhere in the world, you shouldn't even be thinking about it, do that. And I think it was really good advice, actually. So anyway, I took that scholarship and went to England then for a postdoctoral year. End of that year, I became a father at the same time. My oldest son, Michael, was born same year as I got my PhD, in fact, the same month. And 2 months later, we left for England. So on an NRC postdoctoral fellowship, which was actually surprisingly generous. It was fairly generous in Canada, I think, even, but at that time, things were relatively cheap in England, very, very different than now. But the Canadian dollar went a long way in England, so actually the money we made was equivalent. I didn't tell people at the time, but it was equivalent to what people were making as readers in the universities in the UK. So we had lots of money to travel and do theater and music and all these things, which made it a tremendous year on its own. But it also was really good academically, that I was at University College with Dennis Lindley, who's a well-known Bayesian and one of the proponents of the subjective Bayesian approach to things. And also there were Phil David and Adrian Smith, both pretty well known in the discipline. They were just starting out. Adrian was a graduate student of Denison. They were working on the hyperparameter models, right? Parameter models for Bayesian hyperparameter models in linear regression, I think it was. They presented a paper at the RSS a bit after that. Dennis thought I should do, Lindley thought I should do some readings in Bayes, and so he gave me an assignment to read De Finetti and some papers by Savage and also some papers by Lindley. And they were very interesting, and I hadn't really looked at that at all before, and thought it was quite fascinating. The subjective view, which I still think is quite a sensible thing. My previous brainwashing, however, held. I still maintained the idea of a frequentist being more what I wanted to be, and to some degree, I sort of felt that there was a bit of a switch that not for Dennis Lindley. He was very much a subjective Bayesian, but the background there, the stuff of De Finetti, it's all talking about probability as a measure of belief, and sets out an axiomatic system. In other words, showing that you use Bayes' theorem to update your beliefs, and that's how it all works. But in fact, what Bayesians do, I think many Bayesians do, they're not talking about belief at all. They present you something that's more, here's the probability, and it's not, here's my probability, this is what I believe, but here's the probability. But they, on the other hand, tell you they have this strong theoretical background in De Finetti and others. I think it's a bait and switch, actually. But nonetheless, I think Bayesian methods are really important, and I don't deny that. I tend to think of them more as generalized likelihood, I guess, in a sense. At University College had its own Jeremy, I think, which is kind of nice. That so we have a Jeremy, they had a Jeremy. Their Jeremy was somewhat more brittle than ours, but so Jerry Bentham actually had died 200 years ago, and he was his bones were preserved in a glass case, and there it might be a tradition we want to think about, but. So at any rate, apparently he was at that time was wheeled in. I don't know if they still do this, but was wheeled into the meetings of the Board of Governors of University College so that he could be present and oversee. He was a great proponent of University College was called the godless institution of Gower Street because it had no association with any church. It was entirely secular at a time when that wasn't the case for most universities. And one of the strong proponents of that was Jeremy Bentham as a philosopher in that period. So he was there to make sure that the Board of Governors didn't do anything to violate the Constitution, I guess. At the same time, I worked a bit with, I wanted to mention tea breaks because that was something I haven't experienced. I only experienced one other time that there were tea breaks like this, but that was in New Zealand where they also had hour-long tea breaks in the morning and again in the afternoon. And at this one, I was quite a surprise, but on the other hand, it was a tremendous time to talk, and I learned a lot about what Phil David was doing and Adrian Smith and some of the other graduate students and people in the department. So we'd have these breaks, and actually often they would go on for an hour and a half or more in the days. I worked a bit on cancer research there with some people working on breast cancer in a connection with Marvin Zellin, who I'll talk about in a minute. Delivered a paper to the RSS, which was from my thesis work with Dave Sprott, 69 paper, or 70, I guess. And again, as I said, very generous scholarship. So we're not that far in 76 years, really. But anyway, after I finished in England, I went to Buffalo, 1970 to 73. I was there for 3 years, and again, it was sort of there were lots of other departments that were much more established, and somehow or other, I thought Buffalo looked really interesting because it was a relatively small group, but it was changing a lot, and had Seymour Geiser was the chair, who I quite admired. He used to visit Waterloo quite a bit. He was the person at the bottom here. He was sort of an objective Bayesian and multivariate analysis, really into prediction. He was. Marvin Zellin, who in the middle is extremely well known for his work in clinical trials, basically, and as a proponent of biostatistics as a discipline. That he was very early a person who did a lot to establish the discipline. So the two of them were there when I was hired, and then Manny Parson became chair of the department as I arrived. Manny Parson is a time series person who came from Stanford. I think, and also has a tremendous record. So the three of them were there. In addition, there was a number of junior faculty that were really very interesting and good. Steve Lagakos and Marcello Picano, both who eventually went to Harvard. Jim Hanley from now at McGill, and Ross Prentice now at the University of Washington. He visited us. Ross Prentice, of course, I'd known him for a long time. So clinical trials and cooperative groups. There was a large. There were two major cooperative groups: the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group and the Radiotherapy Oncology Group, that we worked with, and it was actually quite a fascinating job because we would do travel various places to back and forth for day-long meetings. So I learned about flying a lot. I hadn't flown much before, but got quite routine to arrive at an airport 10 minutes before your flight left, and you ran down the concourse and onto the flight. You didn't do any kind of, none of this stuff with TSA or any of that. And we'd come back the same day, basically. So it was quite interesting. And then these doctors had great places where they had their annual meetings, so things like Vail and San Diego and that kind of thing, which got to go to. While we were in Buffalo, they actually had twin daughters were born. So that's the 2 and 3. We were actually zero population growth people until then, but went from 1 to 3. No chance to stop at 2. We had, they were, I guess, were our anchor babies, although we actually didn't think of them that way. That was a joke. Yeah. At the end, actually, in 1971 to 73, the department really disintegrated at Buffalo in many ways. I mean, it still was doing good work and that sort of thing, but really there was a civil war. People couldn't really tolerate each other. And so that we would go to a department meeting and it would invariably end up with shouting and people marching out of the meeting and slamming the door. And so it was a rather unhealthy environment, actually. And I decided actually in 73 that I was better to do something else, even though I did really like the job and really liked the university. So in 73, actually, I moved back to the University of Waterloo. But before that, I want to do a little aside here, and that is Snowbird. This was 1972 when from Buffalo, Ross Prentice was visiting, and Ross and Marvin Zellen and I went to a conference that was being held in Seattle and stopped off in Snowbird in Utah to go skiing. Well, I hadn't skied very much before, and I see this picture and I think those people are looking down that hill and think, how the hell am I going to get down from here? That's sort of how I remember it. But anyway, we went there, and there wasn't a lot to do in the evenings, so that we would. So Ross and I spent a lot of time. It turns out that Marvin showed up with this galley of proofs for a paper that was going to be read to the RSS by David Cox, and this is the paper on the relative risk model, the Cox model, or the proportional hazards model, that has been so revolutionary in many ways. So Ross and I saw it and couldn't figure out exactly what he was doing. We spent many hours actually talking about this paper, trying to figure out what it was, and worked out most of a discussion on it, and sort of got directed in some research that we did over the next 20 years or so in the subject. So it was really quite instrumental and important for me. So I always think of Snowbird fondly, but not for the hills. Yeah. This is David Cox up here on the left, who also had, that was my first real acquaintance with him, was following up this, that I had a lot of correspondence with him and met him in England a few times after that. I had met him actually when I was on my postdoctoral year as well. So back to Waterloo, where I started, 73 to 84. This is the period before I became chair there. It was a good department, and a number of these people you've heard before. Ross Prentice was there at that time, although he left about a year later after I got there. Jerry Lawless, Dave Sprott, my brother. Mary Thompson, Jane Gentleman, and Lynn Billard were all on faculty at that point, and they were at that point. So there were 3 young women, all of whom went on to be presidents of statistical societies, one or other, and all who had quite distinguished careers in statistics, chaired departments as well. So that was sort of an interesting part. And Mary Thompson pointed that out some time ago when I think all 3 of them were in presidential positions in various societies. So there I worked on various things, worked on survival analysis largely with theory, and did a lot of work on software, developing software for the Cox model that allowed for time-dependent covariates and time-dependent strata. I think very flexible models. I think that I remember the people in Denmark that were working on this actually got our models and kept telling me that they kept discovering we would think of a new thing to do, and they would discover that you could do it with this software. So I was pretty proud of it. of course it's not used anymore. It was written in Fortran, we did use it for a long time though. Put on non-parametric Bayes, inferential principles, and empirical Bayes. Inferential principles, this is sufficiency, conditionality, and likelihood. I don't know why I threw my hat in the ring on that one, but sufficiency and conditionality implies likelihood, the result of Birnbaum. And I thought I could argue as to why one wouldn't want to use Birnbaum's theorem. So I wrote a paper on that, which appeared in Biometrica with discussion. I was described as a white knight trying to save the frequentists in the discussion. Worse things to be compared to than a white knight, I guess. But so I taught 5 courses each year, actually. Well, in the early years at Waterloo, 5 courses, 2 one term, 3 the next. Had excellent classes, actually. Some very good students. Some not so good students, as always, but in particular, Nancy Reed, Art Owen, Rob Sharani, Vern Farewell were all students that I taught in those first few years at Waterloo, and all well known to people in statistics now. So toward the end of there, 79, 80, I went to the University of Washington, worked with Ross Prentice on the book that appeared in 1982, and had a sabbatical there. It was a great sabbatical. Sharon got a leave from Conestoga College and obtained an MSW at the University of Waterloo. At the University of Washington, so that's why you want the U of W, you see, University of Washington. The kids at that time were 7 and 10 and really didn't want to go. We're sure it was going to destroy their lives and really didn't want to come back. But it worked out really well for them, and it worked out really well for all of us. It was a good year. 84 to 90, I was chair at the University of Waterloo, Statistics and Actuarial Science, and I got a year off for good behavior. Jerry Lawless filled in while I took a sabbatical leave at the end of my first term. So Statistics and Actuarial Science at that time was a fairly large department, 24 faculty with about 30 graduate students and a very large undergraduate teaching responsibilities. While I was chair, actually, the department created 2 centers, one in quality and productivity and one in pension research, insurance and pension research. And then, as well as that, we got an NIH research grant with people from Berkeley and UCSF and NYU on statistical methods for AIDS research. So those 3 things actually set up revenue streams that were quite new to the department, in as much as department very much a hard money department, money from the government, and that's basically where the money comes from. The Institute of Quality and Productivity, actually 4 days after I became chair there, I got a call from the president of the university telling me that he'd been talking to people at General Motors of Canada, and they really would like to find somebody in statistics who would work with them on statistical process control, which was the term at that time for controlling quality. So it seemed to me this was a real opportunity, actually, and so tracked down the people at GM, and eventually we got substantial support from them and other industries to set up this institute, which lasted for about 20 years or so, and did a lot of work, actually, in some of the plants in General Motors. Alas, it wasn't enough to keep them from bankruptcy, but certainly we saw many interesting problems in that work. David Cox actually was a frequent visitor from the department. He took a position as an adjunct professor and came for about a week in each summer. And at the time I was chair, my brother was the dean of the faculty. Most of the time I was chair, he was dean. We did have to work around that in certain instances, but he was generally pretty supportive. So these are actually 2 new hires here that we got. Vern Farewell came from the University of Washington, and Jeff Wu, who later came to Michigan, came from Wisconsin. Jeff was the chair, sponsored by General Motors, and Vern Farewell was with a joint program we had with Health Studies at the time. Around this time, and actually maybe a little bit earlier, I started a long research collaboration with Jerry Lawless on multi-state processes. One of the things that motivated that was applications to AIDS in this NIH project. But we also were interested in things to do with case cohort studies, which was something that Prentice had recently proposed, two-stage sampling, warranty data in the context of the quality and productivity entry, which basically is trying to figure out what happens to a component once you manufacture it and it goes out into the world. How do you find out how it's working? So how do you analyze? You get feedback perhaps from warranties. That's maybe the main place you get warranties. How can you use that warranty data in order to learn about quality in the field? So that was one of the things, actually a lot similar to some of the problems in AIDS. 87, 88, I took a sabbatical, and this was my introduction to Michigan, actually, in 87, 88. And Jerry Lawless filled in for me. He's a great friend and did a great job, as usual. Fall term at University of Michigan, Graham Colton was the chair. Mort Brown, Mike Benke, I think, are the only two people still active in the department or still in the department. Although, well, Mort Brown. Others, Bob Wolf and Anant Shirsagar, who retired from the department, and Dick Landis, L.J. Way, and a number of others, but gave a course on likelihood and interacted with various people on research, taught Mike Benke a few things about racquetball, and all in all, it gave me a really positive feeling about Michigan, actually, as a place where people got along very well and quite a good university. It looked like an interesting department, and also it gave me an introduction to Ann Arbor, which I thought was quite a pleasant town. After that, however, I didn't want to stay even with all the attractions of Ann Arbor. I decided not to stay for the winter and went to UCSF in Berkeley for the winter part of the sabbatical. Worked with Nick Jewell and John Neuhaus there. Again, that was part of the AIDS project. They were involved and also worked on mixture models. Thinking a fair bit about mixture models and in terms of applications, but also in terms of the theory of how to analyze mixture models. And Sharon was able to get a leave again. That worked out pretty well. Conestoga seemed to be very willing to accommodate us, and so that she was able to come with me as well, along with our daughters. Michael had at this point graduated from high school. They were 15 and mortified both ways, actually. That how could you take us away from high school at grade 10? And turned out it wasn't too bad. So sabbaticals are the best. They're the best, actually. You get a time to think a lot about things that are happening. It's a great perk of university appointment, I think, that you get a lot of time to think about things in a different way than you can normally. And I think as far as at least my experience was, at least as far as families, it was a time that really brought the family together, that was a very positive aspect of sabbaticals, and I never felt that we shortchanged the kids by moving them at those times. 90 to 98, I became dean. I don't know why I became dean. I hadn't really been thinking I wanted to be dean necessarily, but I was finished as chair and the dean search was on, actually, because at that point Jim had moved to central administration. He'd gone to be associate provost in the central administration of the university, so there was an opening for the dean. And I was encouraged and eventually decided, yes, I would let my name stand, and turned out all right. I enjoyed it. Actually, it was quite different from being a chair. There's no family for a dean. That you don't have a family. It's not like a department. I think that so you should have sympathy for deans. That And but it was actually quite a good faculty. Mathematics was always a concentration of the University of Waterloo. So there was a Department of Actuarial Science, Statistics and Actuarial Science and Computer Science, as well as things in operations research and pure and applied math. Fairly large, about 130 faculty with 2,500 undergraduate majors. It's now, I think, somewhere around 6,000 undergraduate majors in the Faculty of Mathematics at the University of Waterloo. It just keeps growing. About 250 graduate students at that time. So quite new challenges. I had to think much differently than I did before. A lot of connections with the rest of the university and looking for ways to do things in conjunction with others. It was a busy time. I remember marveling that every 30 minutes some new group came in to entertain me, and this was all arranged by somebody. I'd come in and just open my book, and there would be the day's events laid out. Hard progress in many ways, hard to measure, I think, in that position. At least I found it so. I used to actually go to a sports club before and run on a treadmill as hard as I could without getting anywhere. And I thought some days that was pretty good preparation for some days. But then actually I found that in time things did work out pretty well. And actually overall I quite enjoyed the experience. Partly perhaps because my brother was the associate provost and then the provost while I was dean. I had to do a lot of things with the president. I had to bypass him to the president on a lot of things, or anything personnel-wise. But it worked out pretty well. We worked very much on high school liaison, which has always been a strength of the faculty, but it had always concentrated on mathematics and sort of extended it to computer science, which and did a lot more things with the high schools on computer science and developed competitions in computer science. Usual things with giving and that kind of thing that worked on as deans do. One big event, one of the lowlights, was that the government of Ontario got into serious financial problems and cut the budgets to university by 10% all across the board. And so one year we had a 10% cut basically to the faculty. The university set up a major retirement program, which actually Jim organized. And that helped a great deal, but still, with 10% cut, you've got to figure out what to do with greatly diminished resources and figure out how they're going to be distributed at that point. And that was a real challenge. One of the things that made me think actually was that it was really important for a faculty to have some external stream of funding, if possible, as a way to help in such situations. And so one of the things I did work on that was quite successful was setting up an international program so that we could do something outside of the usual requirements for teaching. So we advertised an international program, or developed one, and advertised it especially in Asia. And that created a separate revenue stream. We set up an English as a second language program. Sharon was actually a dean at Conestoga College at that time and was in charge of ESOL there, so that was a very handy connection as well. All this nepotism, I guess. Not really, I don't think. But anyway, that worked out well too with that, and so the two of those things we could put together, and it became a very successful program right off the bat, and has since grown substantially. In fact. Seems to me perhaps even too substantially, quite a very large program now that brings in millions of dollars actually to the faculty at Waterloo, over and above the governmental budgets. So after that, as one of my associate deans said, that once you're no longer a dean, you're a has-dean, and but as a has-dean, I had 2 years of sabbatical, so that sort of helped. Which I went to Auckland, Singapore, Seattle, and Berkeley, and looked after about 1.5 of those years. I'm still owed a half year from the University of Waterloo, so I have to send them an invoice about that, because I came to Michigan with that still on the books. I'm not sure they're going to pay. So I traveled a lot from Auckland and Singapore. We traveled a fair bit. Worked on new things, actually bootstrapping and estimating equations, a lot on mixture models, and rewriting the book on survival analysis with Ross, and a strong new collaborations with Jiahua Chen and Fifeng Hu, both of whom had been postdocs with me. But at that point, actually, now I'm just going to, taking a bit from Monty Python. How am I doing time-wise? I'm over time, yeah. Okay, so this was actually Ms. Monty Python now for something completely different. We set up a business, actually, from Bali on bringing in garden art. We thought that this would be a good thing to do in our period post-Dean. So we were either a retailer or a wholesaler or whatever, however we could sell it. We called the business High on Bali, which was a particular interest to Canada Customs, it seems. It hadn't occurred to us that Bali was a source of all sorts of things that might make you high. But at any rate, this is some of the things. We still have some of these in our backyard, if you're interested. So I'll speed up most of the stuff anyway with the move to Michigan. So I was looking for something new and exciting at that point, and thought that I really would like to move to something that had a position in the health sciences. And biostatistics at UM, I talked with Rod about it, and it seemed like just the right thing. And I knew it was a department that had been growing and doing really well, and that and it seemed to be a department that had a lot of potential. And so again, that seemed really attractive to me. So that I took the position then in January 1st, 2002, on the way from Waterloo, coming down here, just as a good omen, I ran out of gas on the 401, and but did recover from that anyway. Got here. So the department continued to grow and expand as it has ever since in its scope and stature. When I first came, I think it was the smallest department in SPH and sort of the little brother in a way. Well, Rod had done a lot to promote it and to build in a growth model that would allow us to grow quite a bit, and that was really valuable. But I think since then, and certainly now, has expanded to be a real powerhouse in SPH, and the faculty, I think, due to chairs that succeeded me, Rod and Raghu and Gonzalo and Bramar. I'm particularly proud of Gonzalo and Bramar. Proud of Raghu and Rod, of course, too. But Gonzalo and Bramar were both hired into their tenure track positions while I was chair. So life after 19 years in administration, it's been pretty good, I would say. I have more time for research, and I've worked with a lot of people around the department, with Doug Schobel and Vin Mann, Peter Song, Jeremy, Bob Wolf, Kevin He, Yi Li, and others. Supervised or co-supervised on several committees. And I haven't said much about students, but students have been a tremendous resource all through my period. I think I've learned a lot from students, and have really enjoyed supervising students. I was going to put down a list, but I decided I'd better not do that because it would be too long a list and hard to know who to leave out. I had since the sabbatical in Singapore in 2007 again, and aside from that, have done all sorts of traveling in Asia, in China, and India, mainly through various colleagues and former students. So it's been quite a wonderful time. And at Keck, Bob Wolf resigned from the university. I'd been a bit involved with Keck before that, but at that point there seemed to be a bit of a hiatus, and so I joined Keck and became director without knowing a hell of a lot about what it did. But it worked out very well as well. Still a continuing involvement, still spend about 50% of my time mostly working on projects at Keck. Received my NIH R01 as I was retiring in 2012. Jeremy thinks that might be a Guinness Book type of thing. It was my first R01 grant to get as I was retiring, so we'll look into that. Yes. So anyway, it's now renewed until 2021 with Peter Song. So final thoughts. I've been fortunate to be involved with two great departments, I think, as well. Yeah, two great departments and many excellent students over many years. I really enjoyed the mix of administration and research. It worked really well for me. I think probably it cut back a bit on what I could have accomplished in research. But I think the development of strong institutions, strong departments, and faculties and schools is really important. And I think that is, I think it's important that we have people that will do that. And something I enjoyed. I think it's something people should think about. Some final thoughts, and I'm going to show you a few photos rather quickly. But Sharon, of course, has been a tremendous support to me over the years, and we've done a lot of things together. Have three children, as I said, and 5 grandchildren now. Some hobbies with gardening, stained glass, house renovations and building, music, theater, and travel. And Rod thought I should sing, but he didn't tell me that until just before. I don't have anything prepared. So this is these are my grandchildren, actually, or Sharon and mine's grandchildren. This is my oldest one, is now 22. These two are 11 and 13. So at Times Square last summer. This is in Cleveland to see Lion King last summer too. These are 14 and 16, and these are my kids. One in the middle is my wife, actually. Yeah, first one. Yes. Yeah. So. Gardening, which is something I've always enjoyed, sort of landscaping and that kind of thing in our houses. This is Waterloo, actually, the house we had there. And this one I'm putting in a pond, and I guess I was trying to get out of the picture. I don't know what I was doing, but anyway. And this is the pond in its final inclination. But at any rate, this is the garden that I created there. Many of you have seen the garden at Ann Arbor, the house we're in now. Which these are just a couple of shots of it. And some stained glass, and some of the construction projects I've been involved with at the house. So we moved into a new house about 4 or 5 years ago, and this is a fireplace that I built together with a handyman, and this as well as a sunroom that we put together. And that's it. Future plans, at least one more retirement. I think it's retire early and often, and thank you.
So the last ritual of this lecture is actually a student presenting your certificate of tribute to you. And Emily Hector has kindly agreed to present this. And we said that why Emily? Because she's a citizen of Canada. And
and a poutine, no doubt.
Yes, so we are thinking Vladimir or not. So, but I just wanted to, before we do that, the last thing, I wanted to verbalize my own personal gratitude and the gratitude of the department to what you have done. Personally, I do think that naming my professorship after you was the highest honor that any statistician could ever have. So thank you for all the contribution to the next generation. So thank you so much. Emily.
So thank you very much for your presentation today, and thank you for your contributions to the department. So this is a certificate of tribute.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. It's not often that you get to hear about Jack Kaufleisch and Ross Prentice dealing with the Galley proofs of Cox's 1972 paper in Snowbird. So I'll remember that moment for the rest of my academic career. Good evening, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you very much, Jack.